In 1921, there existed in Tulsa, Oklahoma, a neighborhood that Black Americans had built into something the rest of the country had never seen before and has never seen since. 2 hospitals, 2 newspapers, a law firm, a bank, a hotel, an opera house, 600 Black-owned businesses on 35 blocks, doctors, lawyers, dentists, architects, an entire professional class that had built itself from nothing in 2 decades on land nobody else wanted. White visitors came from across the state to see it. They called it Little Africa. Black Americans called it Black Wall Street. It was the wealthiest Black community in the history of the United States. And on the night of May 31st, 1921, the city of Tulsa burned it to the ground. The police helped. And above the smoke, aircraft circled and opened fire on the people running below. The Greenwood district had been built from nothing in barely 20 years. After the Civil War, Black Americans in Oklahoma carved out a community on a patch of land north of Tulsa that nobody else wanted. They built it block by block, business by business, generation by generation. By 1921, Greenwood had its own school system, its own professional class of doctors, lawyers, and dentists, its own hotel where traveling Black Americans could stay, because every white-owned hotel in Tulsa refused to serve them. Money spent in Greenwood stayed in Greenwood. It circulated through the community up to 36 times before leaving the neighborhood. Booker T. Washington visited and called it the most prosperous Black community in America. The massacre began with a lie. On May 30th, 1921, a 19-year-old Black shoeshiner named Dick Rowland stepped into an elevator in downtown Tulsa operated by a white woman named Sarah Page. Something happened. Most likely Rowland stumbled and grabbed her arm to steady himself. Page screamed. Rowland panicked and ran. The next morning, the Tulsa Tribune ran the story under a headline that read, "Nab Negro for attacking girl in elevator." The story was almost certainly fabricated. Sarah Page later refused to press any charges, and the case was formally dismissed. But by the time the charges were dropped, Dick Rowland was in a jail cell, and the city of Tulsa was already reading the headline. By evening on May 31st, a white mob of several thousand had formed outside the Tulsa courthouse where Dick Rowland was being held. They demanded he be handed over. Word reached Greenwood. Dozens of armed Black men, many of them World War I veterans who had fought in the trenches of France for a country that still refused them basic rights, drove downtown to the courthouse. They offered to help the sheriff protect Rowland. The sheriff turned them away. As they left, a white man in the mob tried to disarm one of the Black veterans. A shot was fired. No one has ever established who fired it. It does not matter. The moment the shot rang out, the mob surged toward Greenwood. What separates the Tulsa Massacre from every other racial atrocity in American history is what happened in the sky above Greenwood. As the mob moved into the neighborhood with torches and rifles, airplanes appeared overhead. At least 6 aircraft, some witnesses counted 12, began circling the burning district. Survivors testified under oath that the planes fired down on residents fleeing through the streets. Others reported seeing incendiary devices dropped onto rooftops. The state of Oklahoma conducted a formal investigation in 2001 and officially confirmed that aircraft were used offensively against the residents of Greenwood. It is the only time in American history that an armed aerial attack was carried out against a civilian neighborhood on United States soil. The Tulsa Police Department did not protect Greenwood. Officers marched alongside the mob. When the Oklahoma National Guard arrived, its soldiers did not disarm the white rioters. Instead, guardsmen began arresting Black residents at gunpoint, systematically moving through the neighborhood and taking every Black person they found into custody. Men, women, children, the elderly, all were marched at gunpoint through the burning streets to detention centers at the convention hall, the fairgrounds, and the baseball stadium. As the columns of Black Tulsans were marched away with their hands raised, white rioters looted and burned freely behind them. The police and the mob were, functionally, working together. By dawn on June 1st, 1921, it was over. Every building in the 35-block Greenwood district had been destroyed. 1,200 homes, gone. The 2 hospitals, gone. The law offices, the bank, the hotel, the opera house, both newspapers, every church, every school, the public library, all gone. The property damage in today's dollars exceeded $200 million. The official death toll was listed at 36, but witnesses described bodies being loaded onto trucks and dumped in the Arkansas River. A grand jury later stopped the counting. More than 10,000 Black Tulsans stood in the ruins of everything they had built, with nothing left but the clothes they were wearing, looking at 35 blocks of ash. 6,000 Black Tulsans were arrested and held in detention in the days that followed. Some were kept for weeks. Many returned from detention to find their employers had already hired replacements. The city moved with extraordinary speed, not to prosecute anyone for the massacre, but to prevent Greenwood from being rebuilt. Emergency zoning ordinances were passed within days of the attack, declaring the burned area a fire hazard and prohibiting reconstruction. When Black property owners challenged the ordinances in court, they won. The city simply refused to enforce the court's ruling. The message was clear: Black Wall Street was not supposed to exist again. A grand jury was convened in June 1921 to assign responsibility for the massacre. It investigated and reached a verdict. Not guilty, the entire white mob. Not guilty, the police officers who marched alongside the rioters. Not guilty, the city officials who authorized the aircraft. The grand jury ruled that the Black community of Greenwood was responsible for the destruction of their own neighborhood. Specifically, they blamed the armed Black men who had gone to the courthouse to protect Dick Rowland from being lynched. Insurance companies refused every claim filed by Black Tulsans. Not a single white person was ever charged with any crime in connection with the Tulsa Race Massacre. Not one. Not ever. Then came something almost as calculated as the massacre itself: the erasure. The Tulsa Race Massacre was not taught in Oklahoma schools. It was not mentioned in local newspapers after the initial coverage faded. City records and documents relating to the massacre disappeared from the official archives. Many historians believe they were deliberately destroyed. For more than 70 years, an entire generation of Oklahomans grew up with no knowledge that their city had destroyed the wealthiest Black neighborhood in American history and bombed it from the air. The survivors, many of whom lived for decades afterward, were largely silent. Some never told their own children what they had seen. The massacre existed only in the traumatized quiet of those who remembered. In 1982, a historian named Scott Ellsworth published a book called Death in a Promised Land, the first serious scholarly account of what had happened to Greenwood. It was largely ignored. 15 years later, under pressure from survivors and descendants, the Oklahoma legislature created an official commission to investigate. In 2001, the commission published its report. It confirmed the massacre in full: the planes, the police complicity, the deliberate cover-up, the systematic obstruction of rebuilding. It recommended that the state of Oklahoma pay reparations to survivors and their descendants. The Oklahoma legislature read the commission's report, debated it, and then did nothing. In 2020, the city of Tulsa authorized archaeological excavations to search for mass graves. They found them. Human remains were uncovered in Oaklawn Cemetery, bodies showing evidence of gunshot wounds, buried in mass graves that the city had then built a parking lot over. The excavations are still ongoing. In 2021, on the 100th anniversary of the massacre, archaeologists confirmed multiple burial sites containing victims who had never been officially counted, never been named, never been acknowledged. A century after the massacre, Tulsa was still finding bodies it had forgotten it buried. The official death toll of the Tulsa Race Massacre remains, to this day, unknown. Her name was Leslie Benningfield Randall. She was 107 years old. She had been 7 years old when the massacre happened, old enough to remember the smoke above Greenwood, the sound of gunfire, the walk to the detention center. In 2021, on the 100th anniversary of the massacre, she sat before the United States Congress in Washington, D.C., and asked for reparations in a voice that did not waver. Congresspeople listened, took notes, expressed sympathy, then did nothing. Leslie Benningfield Randall died on October 30th, 2023. She was 109 years old. No reparations were ever paid. The last living witness to the destruction of Black Wall Street died without seeing a single dollar of justice returned to the people it was stolen from. Greenwood's residents rebuilt their neighborhood despite everything. By the 1940s, Black Wall Street had recovered much of its vitality. Then, in the 1960s, the city of Tulsa routed Interstate 244 directly through the heart of the rebuilt Greenwood district. They demolished it a second time, this time legally, with federal highway funding. The highway runs through it today. If you drive that stretch of I-244 through North Tulsa, you are driving over the exact ground where Black Wall Street once stood. Most people who drive it every day have never heard of it. That's not an accident. Subscribe, because the history that was deliberately erased is almost always the history that matters most.